Ever stood under a sky so wide your secrets felt small? Here on Cowboy Story, we ride the stories of the West campfire, truths, trail dust, memories, saloon whispers, gritty humans sometimes messy. Every tale is a horizon to chase. Subscribe, pull up a stool, and maybe find a little courage for your own frontier. The heat on the Llano Estacado made the air look alive. Dust lifted in little veils around Jonah Pike's boots and stuck to the sweat on his neck. He walked a straight line that had no destination, a shovel on one shoulder, a bottle in the saddlebag. His pocket watch sat in his vest, face cracked hands frozen in place where they had stopped years ago. The tick had died, and time with it. He did not say much now. Words felt like grit between the teeth. 3 weeks earlier, he put his boy in the ground on a rise where the wind cut clean. After the burial, he sold the herd, struck a match to the barn, and watched light eat old timber without a sound from his throat. The night was bright from the fire and still felt empty. That morning smelled like singed grass and iron. Insects buzzed, then paused. Far off, a hawk wrote thin circles you could not read. Jonah kept going across a skin of dry grass that rolled forever, the horse trailing behind reins loose across the horn. When the cry came, it did not sound like a coyote, did not sound like a calf. It sounded like something left behind, the throat gone rough human and not a voice at the edge of breaking. He stopped. The cry came again, thin but clear. He turned to the sound and saw a fallen cottonwood, its roots in the air and its bark peeled white by weather. A girl was tied to it. Rawhide cut into both wrists, purple and swollen. Her dress hung in ribbons where the sun had chewed it. Dust streaked her hair and crusted at the line of her mouth. Flies worked her knuckles where the skin had split. For a breath he saw Hannah, not the face, not truly, but the shape of a person refused by the world. That quick, and he was back in a kitchen with a lamp turned over and a doorway yawning open where it should have held a body. The picture passed. The tree and the heat returned. He went to the girl. She watched his knife hand first. Her eyes were wide, not empty. Her lips parted, stuck to themselves, then peeled apart. She tried to speak, but the sound broke and fell. She tried again. Split it, cut the loop. He froze. The words brushed the wrong image across his mind and raised shame like a slap. She lifted her wrists, and he saw what she meant. The rawhide had been wrapped and twisted and pulled tight with a wet knot that had dried like bone. He set his palm against the strap to keep it from biting deeper. He slid the knife under and felt the heat of her skin pulse against the steel. The blade shook. He leaned in, worked the edge, and lifted his wrist to pry instead of slice. The knot resisted, then gave. The strap jumped open with a dry pop. He cut the other side, and the girl slumped forward into him. She weighed less than the bundle of fence posts he had carried the day he burned the barn. Her breath hitched. He smelled sun and salt and the sour edge of thirst. He eased her down into a patch of thin shade where the cottonwood's roots made a cradle. A canteen sat in the roots pressed into the dirt as if someone had kicked it there with the heel of a boot. He dug it out. It was warm and light. He wet her lips first. He tipped only enough to darken the cracks. She caught at the water with her mouth, but did not swallow right away. He let her take it a sip at a time. He broke a piece from the hardtack in his saddlebag and softened it against his tongue before pushing it into her hand. She chewed without looking up. A tremor worked across her jaw and then settled. He studied the knots that had held her. The rawhide had been braided thin good at cutting bad at mercy. Whoever tied them knew how to hold a steer and how long flesh takes to fail under sun. On the bark near where her wrists had been, something had been carved with care that had no hurry in it. 2 letters cut deep each line, straight and sure, K and R. His chest felt too small. He ran his thumb along the cut. The edges were fresh. Sap beaded along one stroke, amber and sticky. He looked beyond the tree and saw the tracks. Wagon wheels had dug a double line through the grass toward a low seam in the land. The ruts were sharp and held a dark that meant moisture, heavy load, fresh, east. He knew that seam. Dry Cedar Creek ran there when rain had a mind to gather. A horse nickered somewhere beyond the rise. He could not see it. He did not call out. He scanned the fence of horizon until heat shimmer erased distance. Nothing moved. The girl tried to sit up. Her hands did not work right yet. He guided her by the elbow and rested her back against the cottonwood. The bark printed the shape of itself into her shoulder. "What is your name?" he said. She licked salt from her lip. "Mara. Mara Ellison." The syllables came as if she were reading them off the skin of her mouth. "Where from?" "Abilene." She glanced at the canteen. He lifted it and offered a smaller sip. My mother died last winter. The words sounded like something recited in a church kitchen. My mother's brother took me from the house. He said there was work, housework, south. There was a wagon. There were men I did not know. Jonah nodded once. Silence sat between them and did not feel empty. She looked past him to the open land and dragged in a breath that made her cough. When she could speak again, she said one more name as if pushing a burr free from under her tongue. Cade Ransom. They called him Kite. She swallowed. He tied me here. Jonah had not heard the nickname in a long time. It landed like a small stone in a basin and sent out rings. He had paid Cade once on drives when days blurred and nights were a map of songs too quiet to carry. Cade had a way of smiling, with no warmth, and looking like he knew something you should ask, but never would. He was gone the night the lamp tipped in Jonah's kitchen and the back door opened into a wind that did not return what it took. Mara's gaze slid to his vest. "You are not Law," she said. "No," Jonah said. "Can you keep me from him?" He looked again at the cut initials. He closed his hand and felt the grooves hard under his palm. He did not answer right away. He reached into his vest and took out the watch. The face caught a fat beam of light and flared. The crack ran like lightning through the center, and the hands lay quiet, as if they had never moved. He wound the stem out of habit. The crown turned with a faint rasp. The hands did not stir. "Drink," he said. He offered the canteen and steadied her hand with his. She took in water the way a shy animal does, quick with breaks to listen. She gave the canteen back and tucked her chin to her chest. He saw under the dirt a few small letters scratched into the inside of her left forearm with something that had not been sharp. A-M-E. The lines were ragged and the M leaned. He did not ask. People marked what they did not want to forget. He walked to the place where the wagon had stood. Grass bent one way, then rose a little. A cotton strand caught on a mesquite pale as breath. He knelt, pressed fingers into the rut. Damp, cool under the top heat. The horse behind him stamped once and flicked an ear at a fly. When he came back, Mara's eyes tracked him. She had more color around her mouth now. Fever burned under her skin, but had not reached her mind. "Thank you," she said. The words were shaped carefully, as if she did not quite trust them. He shook his head. "We are not done." He took a square of cloth from his saddlebag and wrapped it around her right wrist where the rawhide had chewed deep. He tied a knot he could undo with one pull. She watched his fingers. "You know knots," she said. "Some of them." He tucked the end under and seated it with a finger. He looked at the old cottonwood, then at the pale skin of its peeled trunk, and the roots curled up to the stone like a hand. The wind moved over the grass and made a sound like breath in a room you thought was empty. Mara looked past him at the land. "It never feels safe out here," she said. "It never promised to be," he said. He helped her up. Her legs shook, then held. He led her to the horse and touched the animal's neck. The gelding snorted and steadied. The saddle creaked when he put her up behind the horn. He could feel heat coming off her like a stove that had not gone out. He slid the knife back into its sheath and picked up the shovel where he had dropped it. He stood a moment in the thin shade and listened. Nothing spoke. Even the hawk had given up its circles. Jonah took the reins. He glanced once more at the letters on the bark, then at the ruts that ran away toward Dry Cedar Creek. The earth held the marks of wheels and the done work of a knot. He set his teeth, adjusted the weight on his shoulder, and started walking. The horse took the first step slow, as if the land might tilt. Jonah walked beside the stirrup and kept a hand near Mara's knee so she would not slide. Heat slid along the grass like a living thing. The ruts lay ahead in two dark tracks that held a little damp where shade clung near the ground. Dust rose and settled on his tongue with the taste of clay. Mara held the horn with both hands. The bandage on her right wrist went from clean white to brown where it met the rawhide burn. She sat forward as if leaning would make the earth pass quicker. Her breath smoothed out and came steady now, though sometimes a small sound caught at the end of it. They went in silence until the cottonwood dwindled behind them and the two carved letters could no longer be seen even if you turned to look. Jonah did not turn. He held the reins and listened. The swing of the bit clicked now and then against the horse's teeth. Insects sang in a flat sheet until a hawk cut across the sky and they paused, then began again. He watched the ruts for sign of age. The edges had not slumped. Grass lay pressed and had not risen. A smear of axle grease had caught dust and held it in a soft line. The wagon had moved in the night, or in the cool hours before full morning. He put two fingers into one rut. The soil was cool below the skin of heat. Mara shifted. He reached up to settle her heel in the stirrup. Her boot was a size too big for her, and had rubbed a red line on the heel. He looked away and said nothing. He did not tell her to be brave. He did not say she was safe. He put his palm flat to the horse and felt the slow drum of the animal's heart. They came to a low swale where the grass turned a greener shade, and the scent of sage rose clean under the smell of hot dust. Jonah lifted his hand for a pause and looked long. The ruts went on. A cotton thread had snagged on a mesquite and trailed in the light breeze. He went to it and pinched it free and let it fall. He did not keep souvenirs. Mara said, "I thought you would leave me at the first ranch you found." Her voice was stronger now, less broken at the edges. He said, "There is no first ranch out here that would take this on." He pointed with his chin at the tracks. "You mean him. I mean what he left behind." She looked down at her hands. The letters on her forearm showed through the dirt like a shadow of something carved in stone. She covered them with her palm without thinking. He pretended he had not seen. He gave her water again, one careful swallow, then tipped the canteen so a line ran over her fingers. She held her hand open to catch the cool and let it drip. Some of the wet slid into the bandage and made a dark edge. He would have to change the cloth later, but later did not have a shape yet. "You do not talk much," she said. "Words cost." He touched the pocket of his vest where the watch lay and felt the shape of its cracked face. He did not take it out. He knew what it would say. Mara shifted again. She looked at the sun and then at the way the ruts trended. "East," she said. "East," he answered. They walked until the shadows shortened and then began to grow again by a finger's width. Mara's head bowed once and lifted. He stopped and brought the horse to a standstill in the thin shade of a stand of mesquite. He took his saddlebag down and set it on a flat rock. Inside were a few things that made sense to a day: a small tin of salve that smelled of pine, a strip of clean cloth, a bit of jerky. He worked quiet. He unwound the bandage from her wrist. The flesh below was angry and wet. He poured a little water on it, and the sound of the pour was a small mercy. She bit the inside of her lip and looked off at the line where the land met the sky. He smoothed salve with 2 fingers and felt the heat of the hurt throb against his touch. He wrapped her wrist again in fresh cloth and tied the knot with a loop he could undo with one pull. He showed her the tail of the knot and how to find the loop. She nodded and did not try it. Her fingers shook. She said, "Why are you out here alone?" He looked at the shovel where it leaned against the saddle. He looked at his hand. The skin along his knuckles had a new set of lines that had not been there a month ago. He said, "There was a boy." The words were flat and small and did not carry a picture. He let them sit without more. She did not press. She tore at a piece of jerky with her teeth and chewed until taste came back into her mouth. She watched the open land as if the ground might decide to tell her something. He took a coil of light rope from the back of the saddle and coiled it better. He did it the way a man does something he has always done. The turns fell in the same places and the loop found itself. He tied a small hitch around the horn and checked the cinch. He went to the horse's head and slid the hackamore down a notch so the noseband sat where it could do its work without rubbing. He checked the girth strap and retied it. He slid 2 fingers under to feel the space. Mara watched his hands and said, "You know how to make things hold." "Sometimes." He looked at her wrist and then at the watch in his vest again. He took it out. He did not know why he tried. The crown rasped and turned. The hands lay quiet. He held the watch to his ear as if an old friend might whisper. "Nothing." She said, "The sheriff in Abilene took money from trail hands and from men who ran girls. I saw it from the kitchen door. I was a plate in the sink." He said, "That is Abilene. And here." He looked at the ledger of the land. He thought of a desk in Tascosa where Sheriff Doyle kept a drawer that stuck. He had seen the man's eyes when he had to tell a mother that her son would not come home. He believed in the drawer and in the eyes. "If I find him," she said, "will you kill him?" "No," he said. The word came out like a board laid flat. He wanted his mouth to say the rest. He had always wanted to say the rest. He felt the burn rise in his chest and then pass. "No, I will tie him and hand him over." She watched his face to see if he believed it. He held her gaze. He did not add anything that would make the words softer or harder. He broke off a last piece of hardtack and softened it as before. He gave it to her and waited until she swallowed. He stood and put the saddlebag back. He ran his palm along the horse's shoulder and felt sweat under the hair. The saddle creaked when he put his weight on the stirrup to mount. He did not climb up. He walked again, and the horse followed with Mara on it. The land opened, and the draw ahead made a low seam like a folded blanket. They crossed a stretch of ground where the soil was cracked into plates that knocked lightly under his boots. A jackrabbit broke out of a tuft of grass and went skimming low, with ears laid back. The sky burned white near the sun and blue where it had depth. There was no cloud to hold anything down. Mara spoke after a long time. He had said little, and the silence had become a thing she could lean against. She said, "If he finds me, he will be mean in the way he is when he does not have to hurry." It came out with no drama, an item placed on a table. Jonah said, "Then we do not give him time." He did not look up as he said it. He studied the cut of the ruts and the way the grass bent. He read the ground as if it had letters. A ridge of darker green marked where dry cedar laid its course in a lazy bend when it actually held water. He could smell a line of damp before they reached it. The sun had begun to slide off its highest point, and the light had softened by a breath. Cottonwoods gathered near the bend, their leaves clacking in a small wind. A thin smoke line hung far enough off that you could pretend it was a trick of heat, but he could smell it and knew better. He adjusted the lay of the rifle in the scabbard and checked the strap by touch. He put his palm to Mara's calf so she would know to brace. He led the horse down the slope toward the draw. The ruts dropped into the soft ground and darkened. He could see where a wagon had stopped and started, and the print of a heel that had slid when a man stepped off the board. He held his breath for a count and let it go. The sound of running water did not carry. The bed was dry here. Only the idea of water hung in the air, trapped in leaf and shadow. Jonah set his shoulder and moved forward. The grass closed behind them, and the land took back its silence. The draw deepened, and the air cooled a shade. Mesquite cast tight shadows that lay like finger marks across the ground. Jonah walked with the reins slack and read the sign where light reached. The wagon ruts held clean at the edges, then broke where the driver had cut toward higher ground to avoid a soft patch. He could see where the back wheel had dipped, and the team had dragged it out with a long pull. A man had jumped down and walked a short way, boots turning the soil, heels digging in. The stride said tired more than careful. Mara sat quieter now. Color had come back along her cheekbones, but left her lips. She shifted to ease the rub where the saddle met her thigh. He passed up the canteen and watched the line of water touch her mouth and vanish. She gave it back and wiped a thumb across a wet streak on her chin. They moved until the sound of insects gathered again into a steady hum. A killdeer darted across the open and cried its false broken wing to draw them off. Jonah let it play and kept to the ruts. Ahead, the draw opened into a wider basin where scrub cedars had found room. A single quail called. The smell changed. It put a sour note of old ashes under the clean sage. Mara said, "Do you know him?" Jonah said, "I know a piece. He left it in my house." She watched his hand go to the vest pocket. He pulled the watch out without looking and let it rest warm in his palm. The hand stared back dead quiet. He snapped the lid shut and returned it to its place. They came upon a bend where a low shelf of rock held back a skim of dust like flour. He stopped and put his fingers into the surface. Tracks pressed there were fresh enough to hold fine ridges. He looked at the depth. The wagon had weight on it, not rock. Boxes. Boxes had corners that bite the canvas and leave scuffs on the inside. He had thrown enough tarps to know the feel of how a load rides. Mara said, "Why would he tie his letters to a tree?" He wanted someone to read them. Who? The man who would understand? She sat with that. The gelding flicked at a fly with his tail and made a slow circle with one ear. Jonah tied him to a mesquite and went down into the bed of the draw where a trickle had once worried the soil into a lace of channels. He put his palm flat to the ground. Cool lay under the surface like a hidden coin. He straightened and wiped dust off on his pants leg. He said, "Slide down." She let her legs hang, then eased into a stand. The bandage held. He offered his arm. She took it and stepped light. He led her under the mesquite shade where the dirt would not bake her feet through the boots. He took the small derringer from his saddlebag and set it on the flat of his hand, as if offering a delicate tool rather than a piece of iron. "Have you used one?" His voice had no judgment in it. She shook her head. He showed her how to hold it, not tight so the kick would drive pain into her wrist, not loose so it would jump. He showed her how to thumb the latch, break the barrel's check empties. He let the two small cartridges sit on her palm. They shone dull gold with dust worked into the grooves. He kept his talk to the needed things. Thumb here, pivot here. Do not put your finger near the trigger until your eyes have a place to send the bullet. He had learned long ago that panic has fast hands and slow aim. She practiced the motions. Twice the latch would not catch. Her mouth tightened, and she reset without asking for help. On the third try, the barrel snapped shut smooth. Her knuckles showed white and then eased. He took the gun back, unloaded it, and put it away. He did not want stray noise to carry. Mara said, They called him Kite. She watched the ground as if it might answer. He waited. She said he liked to stand with one foot tipped and his heel up when he talked so he could move quick. And he liked to hear himself tell other men what they were going to do before they did it. He could not hold a line on a trail drive without looking away, Jonah said, but he could pick a way through a gully like a coyote and not shift a rock. He thought of Hannah at the kitchen table, where the lamplight pooled, cutting cloth with a small knife and folding the edge with quick thumbs. The hum of night outside the window, the door that did not hold, the air that smelled like turned earth. He let the picture fall back where it belonged. They climbed out of the draw, and the world spread again in a soft bowl. A jay scolded from a thorn bush. A smear of smoke hung where the basin should have been empty. The color of it was right, not a camp cook fire that snaps. A smolder from wood that had been made to burn, slow and mean. He breathed through his nose and tasted it on the back of his throat. He said, "We will go careful." He kept his voice level. He did not look at her to see if fear had moved back in. Fear had a place and did its work. They led the horse along a faint cattle path that climbed the side. Brush scraped Jonah's pants and left a smell of resin on the cloth. He paused where a cluster of cholla threw more shade than it looked capable of. He crouched and looked over the lip. Below the basin cupped a line shack that had been set there when someone thought a man might need a roof for a night. The roof sagged now at one corner, where a board had lost its fight against weather. A rope hung from a nail by the door and ticked the wall when the breeze moved. Smoke bled out from behind the shack, where a small pit had been dug and filled and raked. A wagon stood at an angle with a canvas thrown over its bed. One wheel showed a fresh chip where it had struck rock. The team was gone. Mara stood close enough for him to feel heat through her sleeve. He held up a hand. She stayed where she was. He watched longer than it seemed necessary. No shape moved, no horse huffed, no worse. Flies made a small moving cloud near the pit and then drifted away. He said, "Stay behind the cholla. Keep your head low and your hands quiet. If I shout, you lie down and let the ground take you." She nodded once. Her face held steady. Sweat ran down her temple and into the line where dirt had gathered along her hair. She wiped it with the back of her wrist and left a dark streak. He slid down the slope with his weight on his heels and his toes on small bites of rock. The dirt gave in a small flow. He stopped at the bottom and listened with his mouth open the way hunters say you can feel sound better. The tick of the rope against wood carried again. That and nothing. He crossed to the wagon first. The canvas had been pulled tight and tied with a series of hitches along the rail. The knots were fast and had been set by a hand that knew how to keep a load from walking. He studied the pattern and saw the small pride in it. He set his knife under one knot and walked it back without cutting. The canvas sagged. He lifted it and slid it over the bows. Inside wooden boxes sat nested together. A brand burned into one side matched the old brand he had sold with the herd. The sight went through him and left a hollow. He touched the mark with his fingertips as if to see if heat lived there still. A coil of wire lay wedged at one end and a tin of nails rattled in a corner. A small canvas sack had a shape inside that moved against the light. He opened it and a silver locket fell into his palm. It was small and oval and had initials on it that he did not have to read to know. He closed his fist until the edge bit his skin. He stood with his fist closed and the taste of metal under his tongue. A jay called again and the rope ticked and the smell of old fire lay low. He breathed once and put the locket into his vest pocket in a place that had held little for years. He drew the canvas back over the wagon and tied 2 hitches fast with short tails. He went to the shack door and set his hand near the latch without touching it. He looked at the dirt by the step. One set of boot tracks had come and gone in a restless loop. Another set cut across and stood at an angle, as if the man had waited and shifted weight. He thought of Cade with his heel up. He looked at the latch again and left it closed. Behind the shack, the pit had been raked flat. The ashes were faint on top and darker under. He stirred them with a stick, and the old heat puffed up and put a thin smoke into his face. Among the gray lay small shapes, wire cuttings, teeth of a comb, a broken button, nothing that carried a name. He put the stick down and wiped his fingers on his pants. He heard a small sound and turned. Mara had come down the slope without calling it out and stood at the corner of the shack with the derringer in both hands pointed at the ground. She had not stepped into sunlight. He went to her and took the gun and slid it into his belt. She did not argue. Her eyes went to the wagon and to his vest pocket and back to the wagon. "Is it hers?" she said. He said it was. The word landed dull. A breeze moved across the basin and lifted ash from the pit in a gray sheet that settled as quick as it rose. The rope by the door clicked the wall twice. He looked at the door and at the shadow inside the room that he could not make into shapes. He told Mara, "Take the canteen. Sit with your back to the wall here where the chola shadow reaches. Do not move unless I tell you." He set her with care so she could see the wagon and the open of the basin. He put the rifle within his reach and kept the pistol low. The land held its breath and then let it go. The shack stood with its roof sagging, and the pit sent up its thin reminders. Jonah touched the locket in his vest once and let his hand fall away. He set his feet where he could push off in any direction. He waited until the hum of insects found its tone again, and then stepped for the door. The latch turned with a soft scrape. The door stuck a little and then gave. Jonah let the room shape itself around his eyes. Light came through a gap in the roof and fell in a pale square that showed dust drifting like slow snow. A table tilted on a leg that had been cut too short. A tin plate with a rind of bacon fat. A cot with a wool blanket rolled tight and a dark stain spread under where a head would lie. The stink of old smoke sat under the raw scent of sweat. He moved one step at a time and let the floor tell him where to put weight. A fly walked to the rim of a coffee cup and then took off and bumped the wall. There was a crate near the far wall with a piece of canvas thrown over it. He reached, lifted the edge, and found paper. Ledger books with leather spines cracked to the brown. Loose pages stuck with thumbprints. A folded map with pencil lines and small crosses where trails met fence lines. He opened the map and saw the shape of counties he could name. By feel the inked river bends the marks where a man had kept score. He heard the click of a heel behind him and knew the sound. He had watched men who wanted to move quick set one foot that way. He set the map down without smoothing it and turned with his hands out from his sides where they could go up or close. A rifle nose pushed air against his chest. Cade Ransom stood in the doorway with sun breaking around his shoulders. He wore a grin that showed a space where a tooth had gone black and left. He kept his weight on one leg and his other heel set for a step that could be fast. "You brought a shovel to a room with a gun," Cade said. His voice had the flat burn of whiskey in it. "I brought my hands," Jonah said. Cade let his eyes drop to the vest and back to Jonah's face. He did not look at the wagon. He did not look long anywhere. "You used to say a man should look where he is going," he said. "You did not on that night." Jonah did not give him the picture. He looked at the rifle. Old Spencer. The barrel pitted. The lever worn smooth where a hand had loved it. He could smell oil gone stale. "You have something of mine," Jonah said. Cade's grin lifted on one side. "I kept a few things warm for you." The air shifted outside. A jay called. The rope on the nail ticked the wall twice. Cade's finger lay straight along the stock. He liked to save his show for the last moment. Jonah put that in the right part of his head. Mara sat in the chola shadow where he had left her. He did not look at her. He saw the suggestion of her shape at the edge of his sight and left it there. He said, "The letters on the tree. Why leave your mark?" Cade tilted his head as if he were hearing a tune he could not place. "I get low and I get proud," he said. "A man should be known for his work." Jonah stepped to his right so the doorframe would not hold him. The rifle moved a finger length with him. The barrel drifted to keep center on his chest. Cade was not careless. He was lazy only when it felt like a gift to himself. Jonah said, "You took the wrong thing. You took what does not belong to you, and you left what ruin you could carry." Cade's lip lifted at the edge. "She did not belong to you either." The room shrank to a handful of objects. The tin plate, the ledger books, the map with its crosses, the Spencer that would buck and spit metal, the length from Jonah's heel to the door, the dry stick of a chair leg near his boot. He loosened his hand and set his fingers. The first sound was not a shout. It was wood leaving dirt. A chunk of mesquite branch lifted outside. Then Mara moved where he could not see her, and the swing came across the doorway in a rough arc. The barrel knocked sideways. The shot blew a long splinter from the doorframe and filled the air with powder that tasted like iron and pepper. Birds came out of the brush in a rush and then quieted. Jonah crossed the room in 2 strides. He grabbed the rifle by the stock and turned his shoulder into Cade's chest. They hit the side of the table, and the cup jumped and spilled a dark ring that had dried long ago. The rifle slid and banged against the cot frame. Cade drove a knee for Jonah's thigh. Jonah drove his head forward and caught Cade under the chin. Teeth clicked. Spit went to the floor pink. Cade swung with the kind of strength a man gets from anger kept on a shelf. Jonah took it on the forearm, felt the flat pain, and did not step back. He reached behind him, and his hand found the heavy piece of stove wood that had stood near the door. He brought it up and sideways, not to break bone, not to end anything, only to change the shape of how air moved in that room. It hit the barrel of the Spencer, and the rifle fell to the floor and slid. Cade grabbed for the knife that rode in his belt behind his hip. Mara was at the threshold, then breath short from the run down the slope. She had the small derringer the way he had taught, low, not tight. Her hands shook and then steadied. Her voice was rough. "Put your hands where I can see them." Cade looked at her and saw a girl and not a threat. That mistake cost him. Jonah wrapped him from behind and drove him forward into the table. One leg splayed and the table went under. Both of them hit the boards. The air went out of Cade with a sound that was not speech. Jonah rolled him and planted a knee between his shoulder blades. Cade bucked, and Jonah rode that motion and took a breath through his teeth. He caught Cade's right wrist and bent it to put his palm up. He fumbled for the rawhide that lay coiled near the door, where a man had dropped it without thought. He got one wrap on Cade's wrist and pulled tight. The rawhide cut into Jonah's knuckles and burned as it took. Cade cursed into the floor. He tried to lift his chin to spit another word. Jonah took the left wrist and crossed it. He tied the second wrap with a hitch he knew blind. He pulled the tail and felt the knot seat. The sound it made was a dry little pop. He sat back and let his weight hold Cade to the floor. Mara stepped in and picked up the Spencer. She held it by the middle as if it were a snake that might wake. She set it against the wall out of reach and kept her eyes on Cade's face. He looked back at her with a slow hate that was not new to his mouth. Jonah took his breath and let it fill his ribs. He looked to his right at the crate. He lifted the ledger and let it fall open. Names, numbers, a column of months, brands in quick strokes, a mark that looked like a child's cross where men had stood up and found nothing left standing around them. Cade said, "You can count all day and the numbers will not make you a better man." Jonah closed the ledger. He set it with the others. He reached for the folded map again and opened it to the light. Pencil had bitten deep where the hand had pressed hard. The crosses were at ranches he knew, at a stage line he had used near a bridge that had groaned under too much weight for too many years. The paper smelled like dust and skin oil and old tobacco. He looked to the corner of the crate. There was a small tin that rattled. He opened it and found a brass compass set in a lid with a hinge. The face was scratched, and the north mark had been nicked by something sharp. On the back, a pocket knife had scratched two letters close together, H and P. His thumb found them by habit. He closed the lid and did not open it again. He put the compass in the same pocket where the locket now lay. Mara said, "That is hers too." It was not a question. Jonah said nothing. His throat worked and then settled. He stood and pulled Cade up by the rawhide between his wrists. He set him on the cot and pushed his shoulder so he would sit. The cot creaked and gave an inch and then held. Cade found his grin again because it was the thing he knew how to put on. "Sheriff will write a pretty paper," he said. "Men like me know where the ink runs and where it smears." Jonah stood close enough that they could have been two men in a different room talking about a fence. He said, "You know how to spoil a trail. I know how to hold a rope. Different trades." Mara reached for the water and took a small drink. She looked as if she wanted to throw what remained in Cade's face and then decided that water had better places to go. She set the canteen on the table that lay on its side and stood again with empty hands. Jonah cut a strip from the end of the rawhide and made a loop from Cade's wrists to the cot frame so any bucking would waste itself against wood. He set the knot where his fingers could find it. He checked the hitch with a pull. It held. He took the remaining rawhide and coiled it neat and hung it on a nail. He liked order even in a place that did not deserve it. He went to the wagon. He lifted each box enough to feel what it might weigh. He set them down where they had been. He did not want the balance to shift. He slid the canvas into place and tied it fast with a series of hitches that made a line along the rail. He left the tails short and neat. The sun shifted and put new light into the basin. Flies drifted to the shade and made a soft whirring near the door. Mara walked the small square of yard between shack and wagon. She stopped at the pit and looked into the ashes with her face set. She towed aside a thin plate of charcoal and saw a bit of comb tooth and did not bend to take it. She stepped back and brushed her hands on her skirt where the fabric still had strength. Jonah gathered the ledger and the map. He slid them into an oilskin bag that had once kept rain off letters he had meant to send and never did. He took a short length of rope and tied the bag to the wagon seat so it would not bounce free. His hands did their work with quiet surety. Cade watched him with eyes that did not stop moving. "You think you can carry me to a desk and hand me over like a stray calf put back through a gate?" he said. He rolled his shoulder to make the rawhide bite and then smiled when the pain came. Jonah said, "I think I can tie a knot and keep it from coming loose." He checked the loop again and set the knot with a little twist of his finger. He picked up the spencer and worked the lever to be sure it was empty. He set it in the wagon under the bench and closed the canvas. He did not want it where a hand could find it without looking. He stepped close to Mara and spoke in a voice meant for her. "You ride on the seat," he said. "Keep the rifle between your knees. Do not point it at anything you do not mean." His words were simple, and he let them sit without weight. She nodded. Her face showed a kind of hard clarity he had not seen when he cut the knot at the tree. He took Cade by the rawhide line and led him out into the light. Cade blinked once in the brightness and then put the grin back on. The world always had a place for his grin, and he tried to find it again. Jonah did not give him a mirror. He sat him on the wagon bench and ran another loop from his wrists around the rail. He put the knot where he could see it with a turn of his head. Mara climbed up on the other side. The bench creaked. The rifles in the bag sat where hands could find them with no jerk. The horse stamped and blew and turned an ear back to listen. Jonah checked the harness, looked at the traces, and then at the way the leather lay along the horse's shoulder. He adjusted a buckle, a hole tighter, and set the loose end through the keeper. He stood a moment and let the land settle around the picture they made. The shack, the wagon, the pit, the rope on the nail, the sound of flies, the smell of ash and dry weed. He put his hand to his vest pocket and felt the cold oval of the locket and the flat side of the compass under the cloth. He closed his fingers once and let go. He took the wagon lead in his left hand and the rawhide line that held Cade in his right. He did not look back at the carved letters on the tree they had left behind. Those letters were here now, in a voice and in a face and in the pressure of rawhide on bone. The wheels started with a groan. The canvas shifted and settled. The team leaned into the collar and the wagon rolled. Dust lifted and then fell on their shoulders like a thin blanket. The basin opened to the draw, and the draw opened to the long plain where the road cut a small idea through the grass. The day had more light in it than they needed. The heat held the horizon in a soft shake. Jonah set his feet where they could move and kept his eyes where a line meant more than distance. The knots held. The ledger sat in its oilskin. The map waited in the same bag. The land accepted their noise and said nothing back. He walked beside the wheel and listened for changes in the sound it made. The cottonwoods at the edge of the draw made their leaf talk in a small voice. The rope on the nail clicked against the shack once and then was too far to hear. They rolled until the light went soft and the shadows stretched long and blue. Wind laid the grass down in one direction and then in another, like a hand smoothing a blanket that would not lie flat. The wagon wheels clicked a small rhythm when the rims found a nick. Jonah walked beside the left wheel and kept his palm near the spoke so he could feel any change. Mara rode the bench, the rifle upright between her knees, her boots set wide so the barrel would not knock. Cade sat bound at her side with his wrists turned palm out, the rawhide biting neat crescents into the skin. Toward evening, the heat slipped its fist. A thin bite of cool came up from the low ground. Jonah checked the line that ran from Cade's wrists to the rail, his fingers testing without looking. The knot held. The rawhide had taken sweat and a little water, and had pulled down hard when it dried. It sang a faint squeak against the wood each time Cade shifted. They did not make a fire. Jonah opened the oilskin bag and looked once more at the ledger and the map, the way a man touches a pocket to be sure a coin is still there. He closed it and tied the bag back where it rode. The horse blew into the dusk and shook its head so the bridle rang one clear note. Mara pulled her shawl tight around her shoulders and set her chin on her collarbone for a moment. Cade watched the land without blinking and let his breath whistle through his teeth, as if it might sharpen a thought. They slept in pieces that did not add up. Jonah sat against the wheel and wore the night like a coat. He felt the ground cool through his back and listened to how the darkness changed the sound of distance. Mara folded into a short sleep with her head tipped forward and both hands on the rifle so it would not slip. The gelding rested a hip and swatted flies that were too stubborn to give up. Cade kept shifting against the rawhide as if discomfort were a way to keep the world in motion. The watch came out once with a click that sounded too loud. Jonah held it without opening the lid and felt the cold through the case. He put it back. When the dark thinned, the land showed itself in gray. Dew gathered on each blade of grass, so the plain looked frosted. The light grew until it had color again. Birds began in singles that became many. Mara lifted her head and pressed her fingers to her eyes, as if to push sleep out. Jonah brought the canteen to her, and she took a mouthful and let some run down into her palms. She scrubbed her face once and was more awake for it. They moved again. Dawn laid a pale stripe on the eastern edge of everything. The earth had the particular smell it gets after a dry night, clean and mineral, with a green thread where ground holds a hint of water nearby. The ruts veered toward it. The salt fork lay ahead, curled into its bed and hidden by cottonwoods that made a stand along the bank. Jonah checked the line on Cade once more. Moisture had raised a small nap along the rawhide's edge where the surface had lifted. The fibers under had started to fuzz. Each time Cade gave a little twist, the line rasped. Not loud. There was a new tone in it. Jonah heard the tone and put it away with other sounds he kept count of. He tightened the knot at the rail by a half turn and set the tail back under itself. Cade licked a crack in his lip and smiled at nothing. He said, "You think a rope cares who it holds." "The rope cares about hands," Jonah said. Cade rolled his shoulder to make the line creak again. He thought of something unkind and let it sit behind his teeth. Mara watched the trees ahead and the way the ground dropped before them. She said, "I know that sound." She meant running water. It was not the roar of spring. It was the low speak of a late creek moving in places and thinking about moving in others. Jonah could smell it. Damp leaf, mud that had dried then softened at the edges. They came to a slow bend where the plain dipped. The creek flashed once between trunks. The bridge showed itself a moment later, a run of boards with gaps that had grown wider with time. A brace leaned at a tired angle. The planks had gray in them, where sun had turned sap, and then strangers had turned wood to smooth with footsteps and hooves. The handrail had a bright scar where a wagon had kissed it too hard. Jonah took a good look at the entry where the ramps dropped to meet the boards. He looked for fresh chips and for any sign of a spike set proud. He put his hand to the horse's shoulder and felt the easy readiness there. He eased the team forward and the wagon rolled with a new voice. The bridge groaned at a pitch that told him which board carried more than its share. He kept to the center where the weight would spread his hand light on the line, listening. Water sounded from under a slow shove against stone where the bed narrowed it. The rawhide squeaked again. Jonah heard the fibers speak to one another as they worked. He took the line in his palm and felt it. He did not like the give. He tightened the knot another touch. It took. The friction warmed his fingertips. Mara shifted so the rifle would not strike the rail. She looked down between the boards. The creek ran with a color like old coins. Small foam licks turned on themselves and went away. The cool reached up through the cracks and made the hair on her forearms rise. She breathed it and let her shoulders drop a fraction. Cade sat without shifting for a beat, and then tried the move with his heel that had always given him leverage. The line checked him. He smiled again as if a private joke had landed. He kept his eyes on the far end of the bridge where the bank rose and the trees thinned. His breathing steadied. His wrists pulled in small pulses that would not show if you looked once and looked away. Jonah said, "Sit still." Cade did not answer. He slid his tongue along his teeth and tasted iron. He had bled a little in the mouth when his chin had met Jonah's head back at the shack. The taste came back now. And he liked it. They reached the span's middle. The boards set their music in a steady pattern. Jonah read it without losing step. A heron lifted from a bar of gravel downstream and went crooked against the light. Past the heron, the far bank opened to a low meadow, and then to scattered timber, and then to a run of brush that had been cut once and had tried to grow back. Mara glanced at Jonah. His face was turned ahead, his mouth a hard, relaxed line. She looked at his hands and saw that the way he could hold tension and ease at the same time, how he could be ready to break a move without telegraph. She sat square and faced forward. She could feel sweat under the bandage on her wrist and the itch of healing. She flexed her fingers once and let the feeling pass. The horse blew and set its hooves careful. A plank under the left wheel complained and then settled. Jonah felt the bridge under him, the way a sailor reads deck in wind. He put 2 fingers to the rail knot again. A thin strand under the wrap had begun to lift. He set it down with his thumb and smoothed it. Cade watched Jonah's hand, as if a man could learn something by seeing which finger moved first. He shifted, and the rawhide rasped again. Fibers lifted another hair's breadth. He kept his face relaxed and his eyes ahead. The grin never changed. It was a tool like any other he owned. The creek made its small talk. Cottonwood leaves chattered in the light. Light came through them in coins and fell on the boards. Insects drifted in the shade under the rail and turned above the water in small, loose spirals. A crow called once from the far side and then went quiet. Jonah felt the draw of the bank in his chest like a horse that knows the barn is close. He told his feet not to hurry. He let the team find their pace. He did not bring the watch out. He did not need a measure to tell him about time in that moment. He kept everything touching the thread he could hold in his hand. The rawhide hummed once in a thin high note and settled. He took that note and placed it with the others, then put his eyes on the last 10 boards and the shade line that lay along them like a belt. The day had turned a degree warmer. The light sharpened on the far rail. The old bridge breathed under weight and held. The bridge sang under the load, and then the song broke. A crack like a green stick snapping rolled across the water. Wood burst from the rail near Mara's hip and went into the creek in a small, bright spray. The gelding went light in the front and screamed. Jonah grabbed the bit ring and hauled the head down. The wagon jolted, and the canvas rattled as if a wind had gotten under it. Another shot tore the air. Splinters leapt sideways from a board near the left wheel. The sound ran along the planks and came back from the trees with 2 short barks of echo. Mara turned on the bench and slid down behind the wagon seat. Her ribs hit wood. She felt the breath knock out and pulled it back with a small grunt. The rifle came with her. She held it flat and kept it in close. 2 riders pushed out of the cottonwoods on the far bank. Faces wrapped in cloth, hats low. The lead horse came sideways to make a small target. The man's carbine hung easy across the saddle. He fired without letting the barrel settle. The other rider set his animal and shifted to open his angle. He had a long gun with a fresh oiled sound. Jonah put the gelding against the rail and stepped out where the wheel could shield his legs. He brought the Winchester up and found the lead horse's shoulder. He let the sight settle on the moving patch of dark hide and squeezed. The horse folded at the knees as if someone had untied it. The rider flailed and came off backward into brush where the bank fell. A shout rose and broke. The second man shot fast and high and clipped at the edge of the wagon bow. Canvas puffed out and fell back. The rawhide line at Cade's wrists took all that movement, and something inside it started to give. The wet from dawn had swelled the fibers. The twist had tightened. Now each small roll of Cade's hands made the inside rub against itself. It sounded like a mouse in straw if you did not know what you were hearing. He bent his hands just enough to pull, without letting the line sing too loud. The wrap creaked and then went quiet. He did it again. Mara set the rifle across the bench and shot once at the second rider. She did not aim to kill. She sent the bullet to the ground in front of the horse, and a fan of dirt jumped and spooked the animal. The horse came around, nostrils long and red. The rider swore and fought the reins. He fired back anyway. The ball took a chip off the rail and a bite out of a plank. The bridge answered with a tired moan. Jonah slid to the other side of the wagon for a new line and found a sliver of the rider's shoulder under the brim of a hat. He shot, and the man doubled down to the horse's neck. The horse bunched and went tight. The rider got flat heels to the animal's ribs. He spurred for cover. Jonah worked the lever and took another shot that took bark out of a cottonwood. He listened. The next sound was the rider breaking through brush, not the click of a fresh round coming back to him. Cade pulled again, and the rawhide said no, and then yes. A strand inside the twist let go. He felt the give as a heat against his bones. His grin found its place on his face, like a habit you do not break even at the wrong time. He brought his hands in, and then down, and then in again. The fibers tore along the edge with a short, dry rip. The last wrap skinned free. The line to the rail still held. His wrists were no longer married. He turned his hands palms to one another and pulled until the skin tore and bled. He liked that pain better than the other pain. It meant direction. Mara heard something at her side that did not belong. She looked and saw slack in the loop at Cade's wrists. Her mouth opened and shut. She drew breath to say Jonah's name and did not say it. The rider was not done. She set the rifle and worked the bolt with deliberate hands. She found the bank where the second man had gone and watched for shoulder-knee muzzle. There, the glint of a barrel's crown. She shot, and the glint went away and a curse came from the brush. Cade lunged sideways. He came up off the bench with his bound wrists still snared by the line that met the rail and used that line like a tether to swing himself. His shoulder hit Mara and drove her to the rail. Her breath went out again. The rifle jumped from her hands and clattered on the boards. Cade's elbow found her throat. She clawed at his shirt and got skin in a mouthful of dust. Jonah heard the sound that knife fighters say sits under every fight. It was the small air sound a body makes when it meets wood. He turned. Cade had Mara up against the rail with his wrists still bound to the wagon by the long line. He had turned his hands so the rawhide did not bite and was using the length as leverage. He dropped his shoulder and moved her toward the gap between 2 posts where time had chewed at the nail heads. Jonah dropped the rifle stock to the planks, caught the barrel with his left hand, and came at Cade straight. Cade pulled Mara into the path as cover. Jonah checked his movement and lost the step he needed. Cade swung his bound hands like a club. The rawhide line whipped across Jonah's forearm and burned a set of stripes into the skin. Jonah drove anyway. He got both hands on Cade's shirt and felt ribs under cloth. He pushed. Cade went back half a step. The rope to the rail went tight and held him. The rail groaned. The man in the brush found his nerve and sent 2 shots fast. One hit the wagon bow again, and the other kissed the water with a slap and sent a spread of drops that shivered in the light. Jonah turned his head enough to keep both Cade and the brush in sight, and put his body where it could do 2 jobs. He hated that position, but there it was. Mara's right hand flailed and found the small brake lever. Wagons carry a brake you can set with a foot and a mind. Jonah had set it light when they entered the bridge to keep the wheels from walking. In the scramble, it had not been thrown hard. Mara shoved it up with the heel of her palm and felt the paw lift and fail to catch. The lever slid loose. She twisted. Her wrist screamed. The lever came free with a snap. The wagon sighed a little as weight shifted backward. The left wheel moved a whisper. She kicked at the block Jonah kept under the bench for hills. The block skittered, stuck, and then went. The wagon rolled back the space allowed by slack in the traces. It hit the rail behind with a thud that shook the whole span. The rail posts jumped in their pockets. The loose one cracked louder than the rest. Cade lost a place to put his weight. His boots scraped and found no purchase on the dust-slick plank. He went down a half inch and jerked Mara with him. Jonah took that drop and made it useful. He stepped in and put his shoulder under Cade's ribs and lifted. Cade's chin hit the top rail. Teeth clicked. He gagged and then grabbed for the top rail to find grip. His bound wrists made him slow and clumsy. The rail moved in the post and gave him nothing. Cade lunged for the rifle that had skated near the outer rail. His hand closed on wood. Jonah hit his wrist with the heel of his palm. The rifle shot forward and slid along the plank. The toe of the stock found the gap and dropped clean. The gun went sideways into the water. The creek took it with a small, heavy sound and a brief sparkle of bubbles that came up and burst without ceremony. The second rider showed again for a breath, and Jonah took a shot from the hip. The bullet took a bite out of the log that had lodged at the foot of the bank. The rider decided the world had given him enough and peeled away into trees with his horse bucking under him. Brush shook and held no one. Cade took his last option. He got both hands on Mara's sleeve and hauled her toward the absent rail post. The post had rocking room. The plank at their feet was slick with dew that the morning had not finished drinking. Mara planted her heel and drove it into Cade's shin. He grunted. She twisted her wrist and felt the bandage pull and then hold. She got a hand on the dangling chain that Jonah had looped through the wagon's brake rod earlier when they had stopped on a hill and never taken off clean. She yanked. The chain came free and dropped in a lump of dull links that smelled like old rain. She threw it under the left wheel as it rolled. The wheel climbed the chain and then slid. The wagon jerked backward that last inch. The rail post broke. The top rail came up and out and left a mouth where wood and air changed places. Cade saw the hole open and laughed once because it felt like a thing he understood. Then his boot went where the plank was not. His weight swung out over water. He lost Mara's sleeve. He pinwheeled. He caught the top rail with both bound hands, but the long line to the wagon pulled him sideways. The rawhide bit deep, and he howled. His fingers slipped. The rail rubbed skin off his palms in flat curls. He hung one breath and looked at Jonah, and the grin found his face one more time by reflex without a reason under it. He dropped. The fall was not far, but the water took him like a mouth that had waited. He went under with a heavy sound and came up 10 feet downstream. He clawed at air and at the slick log, but it rolled him, and he lost it. He rolled onto his back, and the long line from the rail dragged behind like the tail of a kite that had fallen out of a wind. The current slid him to the deeper slot where the channel pinched. He fought, and the line wrapped his legs once and slowed him. He went under again. His hat came up without him and turned slowly in a wet circle. The bridge breathed out. The plank settled. The horse shook as if to throw flies from its shoulders. Mud smell lifted in a warm ribbon. The only sound for a moment was the last of the chain sliding on wood and a few beads of water ticking from the broken rail into the creek. Mara sat down hard on the bench and pressed her palms flat to the seat so she could feel the wood and know it was there. Her chest hitched and then evened. Her mouth tasted like iron from the scrapings of her teeth on her lip. Jonah stood with his feet wide set and his hands open. He looked at the water and saw small signs, a bubble train that meant a body moving under the surface, a tug of brown water where the current grabbed at something heavy. The signs thinned. The surface smoothed until it was only water with light on it and a few seeds turning. He listened for the clatter of a man hitting stones in the shallows downstream and heard nothing. He picked up the chain that had fallen free and coiled it by habit, each loop settling into the next with the sound of links seating. He set it on the wagon floor. He put the block back under the bench. He moved to the broken rail and set the top piece back into the notches so it would at least look like it wanted to be whole. The bottom rail hung with a sullen tilt. He checked the rawhide that ran from the rail to where Cade's wrists had been. It lay across the plank now, slack with the polish of skin and struggle on it. He picked it up and saw where it had frayed and let go. He ran his thumb along the cut. The fibers were as soft as hair. Mara leaned forward and picked up the rifle. Her fingers found the bolt and checked the chamber without thinking. She looked at Jonah. He looked back. Neither spoke. The creek made its small talk in the gap where the rail had been, and the cottonwoods gave their leaf voice as if nothing had happened. He went to the gelding and laid a hand on the animal's neck until the skin stopped twitching. He breathed with the horse until his own breath found a rhythm that did not hurt. He checked the traces in the collar and the line. He tightened the brake again the way it was meant to be tight and not ask the chain to do the job. He went to the bench and picked up the oilskin bag and felt the square weight of the ledger and the map inside. He set it back. Mara said, "He is gone." She said it as if telling the water something not Jonah. Jonah looked at the place where the hat had turned and now did not. He felt the watch in his vest with its cold, round face. He did not take it out. He put his palm flat on the broken rail. The wood was warm where the sun had found it. He took his hand away and his palm had a fine gray line of old weather on it. He stepped to the horse's head and put a palm on the cheek. The animal dropped its head and took the bit easy. Jonah found the reins. He glanced once at the far bank where brush held its shadows and showed no men. He looked upstream and then downstream, long enough to put the picture into his head, where it could stay without changing. He gave a small click with his tongue. The team leaned. The wagon rolled. The bridge talked in its tired voice and held. He walked beside the wheel and watched the last boards come under their feet and go behind them with no more surprises. The creek slid on with what it knew. The broken rail sat behind square in its ruin, and the hat that had turned was gone. They cleared the last boards, and the bridge fell behind with its tired voice swallowed by leaves. The creek kept speaking to itself as if it had always been there. Jonah walked until the sound thinned and then slowed the team on a stretch of packed earth that held wagon tracks from other people who had crossed on other mornings. He let the reins fall slack and stood with both hands on the rail of the wagon while his breath learned a slower shape. Mara stayed on the bench. Her shoulders sank a little and then found straight again. She looked at her hands and found a splinter in the pad of her thumb and dug it out with her teeth. The taste of sap and grit bit her tongue and cleared what dust had left. She put the splinter on her skirt and blew it away. Jonah unhooked the brake and checked the chain she had thrown. The links carried a clay stain like a bruise. He coiled them with small, neat turns and set the coil under the seat where it would not rattle. He went around to the back and put a hand flat to the canvas as if to feel the heartbeat of what it covered. Boxes sat quiet. The oilskin bag lay where he had tied it. He tugged the hitch to be sure. The knot tightened with a small creak and held. He looked back along the road to the stand of cottonwoods that hid the bridge. The morning had taken the sharp out of the light. A hawk rode the steady air above the bend, as if it were fixed to an unseen nail. The surface of the water showed no hat, no arm, no sound. It had a brown slide that turned silver where light took it. He could not turn that picture into anything else. He let it be water. Mara cleared her throat. The sound came rough and ordinary. She said, "Thank you." It was not for something in particular. It was for a handful of moments that had not broken. Jonah nodded. He did not look up. He went to the gelding and set his palm on the warm neck and stood until the twitch under the hide went quiet. He checked the collar and the cheek piece and the traces, then the small tear in the near trace where the leather had split along a line of old drying. He tied a short mending knot in the lace to keep the tear from walking. He dressed the knot flat with his thumb. It had the shape of something made to stay. He walked to the rail where the rawhide had burned his forearm and brushed the red tracks with 2 fingers. The marks looked like they had been written in a language he knew but could not read now. He poured a mouthful of water over the skin and watched it darken. He put the canteen away and picked up the shovel from its place. The weight found his shoulder like a friend that did not ask for talk. They moved again. The road lifted out of the creek bottom into open ground where the wind had room to find them. Mara held the rifle at rest with the muzzle down and the butt tight to her thigh. The bandage on her wrist had gone a color that meant the salve was doing its work under dust. She rolled her shoulders and watched a covey of quail explode from the road bank and scatter. The sound made her flinch. She relaxed a fraction when the birds turned and settled. Jonah walked with his eyes on the horizon, and on the close ground both at once. He had a way of knowing where to place a boot so stones would not slide. The ruts here had been made by someone who liked to ride the crown. He stayed a little off to the side so the horse would not step in holes grown soft by habit. The smell of sage came and went in clean pockets. The sun rose and took the cool away in small bites, not mean, just thorough. They passed a piece of fence that had fallen and a gate that had no latch left. The wire hummed on a wind that had learned its times. A white skull with the horns sawn off looked out from the weeds. It said nothing. It had nothing to say. Mara said, "Do you know where to find Law?" The words had no hope in them and no mockery. Jonah said Tascosa. He said it the way a man says the name of a well he has seen hold water even when the ground around it turned to powder. She looked straight ahead and let the name sit beside her. At noon they stopped on a knoll, with low grass cropped by some herd long gone. The sky had gone wide in every direction. A lone cottonwood stood short and stubborn with its leaves lined in dust. Jonah tied the team to a root with enough slack to let them lower their heads. He checked the rawhide on the yoke ends and rubbed a little salve into a spot where the hair had rubbed thin. He cared for animals because it kept his hands from doing nothing. They ate without a fire, hard bread, jerky cut small so teeth would not complain. Mara drank until her throat loosened and then stopped before comfort made her greedy. Jonah poured a capful of water onto his palm and washed the line of dried blood where the rawhide had marked him. The sting told him he was awake. He let the air do the rest of the work. He took the watch out and opened it. The cracked face caught the sun and threw a white sliver of light onto his kneecap. He wound the stem without faith. The hands did not move. He held it to his ear and heard only wind and the small sounds of metal cooling. He closed it and put it away. His fingers brushed the locket and the flat back of the brass compass. He did not open either one. He knew what they held. Mara sat with her back to the wagon wheel. She drew her knees up to save her back the pull of sitting straight for so long. She traced the letters on her forearm with a clean fingertip, and then covered them with her palm as if to keep them warm. She looked up at Jonah with a question that did not need words. He gave her the smallest nod because she had already seen the answer. They pushed on. The day leaned toward afternoon and put a slow weight on their shoulders. A line of telegraph poles began to show itself in the distance, each one a dent in the sky. Wire connected them in a faint sag that caught light and let it go. Jonah followed the line because it meant somebody had bothered to speak across space and was willing to repeat the message when it failed. The plane gave way to shallow draws and then to a wide flat where tracks multiplied and grew braided. Fresh iron shoes had left half moons that still held edges. Wagons had thrown small stones to the side and ground larger ones into new shapes. They passed a widowmaker cottonwood with a split limb that had fallen and not crushed anything. The wood inside was a clean pail and smelled like rain, even though none was near. Toward late day, the color of the light shifted. Shadows shortened and then went soft. A smear of town dust rose on the line of the earth and then took edges. Rooflines showed, and the square shoulders of false fronts. A water tower stood on spindly legs, as if it should not carry its own height. Smoke from cook stoves and chimneys put brown lines into the sky and let them fade. Jonah slowed the team without needing to speak to them. The horse knew streets and boards and noise, and did not care for any of it, but did not argue the halter. Mara sat straighter and wrapped the shawl close to hide the torn dress where strangers might let their eyes wander. She pressed her lips together once and then let them part to breathe. The rifle sat under the bench now, with the muzzle into a boot scuff so it would not slide. They entered Tascosa along a street that knew how to make sound bounce. Hooves rang on the hard pack and lifted dust that tasted like old nails. A dog trotted across with its tail stiff and its ears low. Men turned their heads and then turned them back. A saloon door banged and left a shape in a frame that became another person when the eyes settled. A bell rang once at the freight office and was still. Jonah brought the wagon to a stop in the strip of shade beside a building with a sign that had lost a letter to wind. The building wore a star painted in flaking white on its front. The paint had run in one rainstorm and dried that way. He set the brake and hooked the chain without hurry. He tied the reins to the ring set into the rail where many hands had tied before him. He checked the knot with a pull that had the same pressure he gave to all knots. It held. He turned to Mara. Her face had less color than it had by the creek, but her eyes were clearer. She set her palm on the oilskin bag and then took it up and held it close. He nodded once. She nodded back. He stepped down from the wheel to the ground and stood a long second to let the feel of earth replace moving board. He put his hand to the vest pocket that held the locket and the compass and the watch and felt all 3 marks against his ribs. He let his hand fall, then climbed the 2 steps to the door. The door opened on a square room that smelled of lamp oil, old paper, and boots that had been wet too long. A plank floor ran to a desk, crowded with ledgers and a tin star laid in a tray like someone could pick it up if they needed to remember what it meant. 2 chairs waited, one with a split seat mended by a strip of rawhide. On the wall, wanted bills curled at the corners and showed faces drawn by hands that had never seen them. Behind a half door, a barred cell sat with its cot made, and a blanket folded to regulation blue, faded to the color of sky, left too long. Sheriff Doyle came out of a back room with a coffee cup and the careful pace of a man who had learned to make motion look easy. Tall hat brim shadowing his eyes, jaw rough with the start of evening. He took in Jonah first, then the wagon through the window, then the woman on the bench with the rifle stock between her boots. His gaze did not linger anywhere rude. "You brought the day with you," Doyle said. The voice held gravel and patience. "Brought other things," Jonah said. Mara stepped in and kept her shoulders square. She held the oilskin bag tight under her arm. Her hair had come loose in places, and dust had found the places where sweat left a track. She did not wipe at any of it. She looked at the sheriff, and then at the desk, and then at the door again, as if taking measurements she would remember. Doyle set his cup on a ledger, and did not bother to move the ledger from under it. He came around the desk and pulled the split-seat chair forward with a foot. "Sit if you want. Talk if you need." He spoke to both of them, and neither at once. Jonah put the bag on the desk and drew the tie loose. Inside, the ledger sat like a brick, and the map lay curled at the corners. Doyle lifted the map, set it flat, and smoothed it with a palm that had scrapes on the heel. His eyes ran the pencil lines with the slow speed of a man who knows how to read with more than sight. He did not make a sound at the first cross, the second the cluster near a stage spur. He put 2 fingers on a bend of river where ink had bled a little. Salt Fork. He moved on. He lifted the ledger. It opened to a page that offered itself. Names made in a cramped hand. Brands caught quick but true. Columns of figures that stacked in a hard rhythm. Doyle turned more pages. In the back, a sheet loosened by use showed marks that were more habit than record. Tallies. A list of initials that paired up with places. Doyle tapped one with his thumb. KR. Jonah did not need to say the name. He had already set it out on the bridge. It hung in the room in the way paper can hold a man better than rope. Doyle said, "Where?" Jonah told it simple. Mesquite Draw. Line shack with one corner sinking. A pit they kept raking flat. A wagon with a chip in one rim. Boxes with a brand that used to sit under Jonah's porch light at the ranch he had burned. He said there had been a compass set in brass and a locket. He did not offer them across the desk. He set his hand flat to his vest as he spoke of them, then took it away. Doyle looked at the vest pocket as if he could see through cloth without presumption. He nodded once. He set the ledger down and slid open a drawer. Inside lay a seal and a short roll of red twine. He bound the ledger with the twine and tied a knot that would show if someone had opened it. He pressed the wax and left the mark of his office with no ceremony. He looked at Mara. "Miss, if you can, I am asking for your words. Name, place you started, who moved you, who was there when you were tied. You can sit while you talk or stand. Some people think better on their feet." Mara stood. She put her hands on the back of the empty chair and let its wood put steadiness into her shoulders. She said her name. She said Abilene. She said her mother was gone, that her mother's brother told a story about work and used a wagon to make it look true, and that men met them where the road held no houses. She said the name Cade Ransom, and the way the men said his nickname, that thing with a K in it, like something light on air. She said the tree and the knots and the heat. She did not say more than those things, and she did not make any of it slow or dramatic. She set the pieces on the table of the room and let them sit. Doyle did not write while she spoke. He watched the space just to the side of her face and counted time by the way her breath shaped the air. When she finished, he moved to the desk and wrote for a while with a nib that scratched in a small song. He dated the page. He set the pen aside and shook the page once so the ink would dry without smearing. He slid the paper into a file and closed it with a brass clip. A boy in a deputy's vest, not much more than whisker age, came in from the side door with a stack of envelopes tied with string. He had a tiredness that did not yet know how to sit on him. Pritchard Doyle said, "Wire the judge and Mobeedi, wire the ranger captain. Use the words that matter and not more. He pushed the sealed ledger and the map toward the boy, along with a note in a tight hand. Keep your hat on in the office. If a man takes it off every time he walks through a door, he will spend his days bareheaded. Pritchard tucked the map and ledger into a canvas envelope and tied it with quick fingers. He set the knot with a jerk and winced when it bit. He nodded at Jonah and Mara, then slipped out boots soft on the boards. From the street, a mouth organ spilled a tune without words. The saloon 2 doors down let out a fly of laughter that rose and fell and carried a piece of talk with it. Ransom's boys ran this stretch. Here they lost a horse. The talk had a shine some men give to trouble when they are only near it. Doyle looked toward the sound and then away. He took a ring of keys from a hook and set it on the desk where it clicked. He said to Mara, "We have a back room, not the cell. The cell is for men who need bars to keep them from making worse. The back room has a cot and a window with a view of alley and fence, and one old cat that does not mind anyone. You can wait there while I get papers that keep you where hands cannot move you without me. Or there is a boarding house run by a woman who makes oatmeal thick and does not sell talk. The boarding house is 2 blocks and 3 doors. Your choice." Mara did not answer right away. She watched the light drift on a dust mote and then looked at the cell and then at the door. "Back room," she said. She did not want to give the saloon another face to pick up and chew in a story. Doyle nodded. He took down a tin cup and filled it from a jug and handed it to her. The water was warm and tasted like the inside of tin. She drank anyway and handed the cup back. He opened the half door and showed her down the short hall to a door with a cracked frosted pane. He pushed it open and said, "You can lock it from inside. If anyone knocks, you can ask for my voice before you open." She went in. He pulled the door until the latch set, then left it at that. Jonah stood at the desk again. He let his fingers rest on the knot that held the red twine. It was simple and square and done right. He looked at Doyle. "Men say you ride for whoever feeds you," Jonah said. "They say different things when they have not watched you." "They say a lot," Doyle said. "I have ears for some of it. When you burned your barn, they said you were trying to make your tracks too tidy." He looked at Jonah and did not dig further. "The record in the drawer will show what the record shows." He looked at the vest pocket again. "You can give me the locket to tag and set aside with the others if you want it to sit in the chain of evidence. Or you can keep it where it has been living. I will write it in either way." Jonah thought of Hannah's hands. He thought of the circle those hands had made for a moment each day when she fastened the chain. He thought of the ash pit at the shack and the little shapes that sat in gray. He put his palm flat to his chest and felt both the oval and the compass back through cloth. He said, "I will keep it. You have the boxes and the ledger and the places on paper. The locket belongs to a room that is not for your drawer." Doyle took it without offense. He wrote a line in his book that said locket observed, owner retains. He signed with his last name twice and made the letters neat. He glanced up and said, "Cade Ransom has friends who like to gather in pairs. Did you meet any on the road?" "2, Jonah said. "One went down in brush. The other found a reason to leave." He did not say the name of the creek. He did not say the word hat. He let the air in the room be only air. Doyle tapped the map where the draw in the shack would be. "I will send men to turn it and pull what is there into sight." He lifted the stack of wanted bills and sorted through them until he found a face with a scar drawn too high under the eye. He set it to the side. He found another with no face at all, just a brand and a name that had been written and erased and written again. He set that one aside as well. He put both into a folder and tied a string around them to keep them honest. Pritchard came back with a return line from the telegraph office. Paper crackled. The judge would issue warrants on the strength of what Doyle had sent and wanted sworn statements at first light. The ranger captain sent a short answer that read like a hand on a saddle horn. "On our way. No flourish." Doyle looked to Jonah. "You came here to do a certain thing," he said. "I am going to do a different thing that touches it. I need to hear one more piece from you." He moved to a shelf and took down a stamped form. He dipped the pen. "You say Ransom stood in your door once upon a time." Jonah said he stood where a door did not hold. He looked at the pen point and the way a drop of ink made a round before it fell. He told Doyle what the kitchen had looked like that night in a list of objects that did not lie. A lamp, a chair on its side, a wind that hurried through and made the flame talk. A dark shape where a person should have been and was not. He did not fill in the space with names. He let the picture be what it was. Doyle wrote the words he needed and left the rest in the air where it did not have to be captured. He slid the form into the file with the others and made a second copy with his clerk hand that kept neat even when he was dead tired. He closed the drawer. He came around the desk and stood a half arm from Jonah. "I never put your name on any paper I did not have to," he said. "I heard the talk. I did not write it down." Jonah nodded once. He had no extra gratitude to spend. He did not have bitterness either. The words sat and did not move. From the street, voices grew and fell. A boy shouted about fresh peaches at a price that would make you think you could afford them. A boot heel clicked a message against a boardwalk plank. A woman laughed a short laugh and made it mean two possible things. A horse shook a harness at a hitching rail, and metal answered itself. Doyle went to the back room and tapped his knuckle on the frosted pane. "Miss," he said, still in the same even talk, "I will have someone sit outside this door. If you want oatmeal and coffee, I can get both from Miss Finch in a tin that does not leak. If you want sleep, the cot will hold. If you need a doctor to look at your wrist, he is 3 doors and a bell. Tell me which." He stood and did not move until a soft voice from the other side said coffee, and the doctor after. He looked to Jonah. "You can sleep in the jail if you want a roof and a bar for your trouble. I do not keep drunks in the day. Or you can sit on the porch and watch the street until it tells you something worth knowing. Either way, I will send a man to look at that rawhide burn. The line on your arm looks like it wants to speak." Jonah glanced at the porch and the street and found both long. He did not feel drawn to either. He said, "I will stand." He did not say for how long. He took the watch out and opened it without thinking. The hands were where they had been. The room did not make a noise that could pass for a tick. He shut it and slid it back into the vest. His fingers brushed the compass and the locket. He left both where they were. Pritchard reappeared with a piece of gray cloth and a tin of salve that smelled like peppermint and copper. He nodded at Jonah's forearm. Jonah held it out. The boy dabbed with a small care that said he had long practice with his own scrapes. The salve cooled the burn in a way that made it more present before it eased. Pritchard tied a strip around the forearm loose enough to slide a finger under. He did it neat. Knots were small work for big hands, but he did this one right. Men in the saloon kept their talk going and put new edges on it. Heard Doyle is fixing to hang half the county. Heard Jonah Pike brought back a ledger says the same as rumor and more. Heard a girl gave names and did not cry. The talk bounced, softened, grew sharp again when it found drunk corners. No one could measure if it meant anything or not. Doyle took his hat from a peg and set it on his head. He came to the door and looked out at the strip of street in front of his office. He stood with his hands on his hips and watched nothing happen for a count that might have been 10 or 100. He moved his jaw and cracked a toothpick to the right length and set it in the corner of his mouth. He said, "We will walk to the doctor with Miss Ellison. Pritchard will fetch the coffee when he comes back from the wires. On the way back, I will have 2 men meet us and take papers to some doors that need knocking." He did not raise his voice. He did not list names. He opened the half door and rapped his knuckles lightly on the frosted pane. "Miss," he said, "time to see the sawbones." The word was said like a kind of joke he let himself make when the person he spoke to needed an easier sound. Mara opened the door. She had washed her face with a little water from a basin that had seen too many faces. The skin on her wrists looked less angry with salve and clean cloth. She had the oilskin bag again and kept it close to her ribs. She looked at Jonah, then at the sheriff. She nodded once. They stepped into the heat that had settled between buildings. The street laid out a simple picture. False fronts, hitch rails, a run of brown dust turning to powder under hooves. The telegraph wires hummed in a tone only men who listened for it could hear. Jonah paused on the threshold and slid his eyes once across the windows on the second floor of the saloon without lifting his head. A curtain shifted and then stilled. Doyle let his elbow brush the doorframe on the way out, a habit like knocking wood. He moved at an even pace that said he had time for what his feet were doing. Jonah took the step behind him. The wagon-weighted canvas dulled with road dust knots along the rails, sitting quiet and square. The horse turned an ear and relaxed its jaw. The red seal on the ledger cooled behind the office door. The town watched without seeming to. The afternoon folded around them and held, and the string of small sounds that make a place alive kept on with no one telling them what order to take. The town let them be after papers were signed, and the doctor set gauze where Rawhide had spoken. Days stacked until they were no longer days you counted. The road east unrolled into grass and scattered timber. The sky went wide again. The air tasted cleaner. The line of the Canadian River lay like a dark seam that held a little shine. Jonah turned off where an old gate leaned. He raised it, set a rock under the hinge end, and eased it back to a stand. The house site had weathered, but not quit. Stone corner posts still sat stubborn. A scatter of char under the old barn pad said Flame once lived here, and ate enough to leave memory. He took off his hat and let the heat lift from his scalp, then set it back and got to work. He cut cedar posts where they grew thick, the sap sweet in his nose. He hauled them to the barn pad and set them upright in holes he had dug with a post spade that rang like a bell when it struck stone. He tamped soil with a bar and leaned into it until his shoulders burned. He ran a line of manila rope tight along the top to keep the frame honest. He tied a clove hitch so the line would not slip. He tied a bowline so it would not jam. He tied a square knot because it pleased him to see the neat symmetry sit flat. Knots spoke back through the fibers when you pulled them right. They did not argue. They just held. Mara carried boards one by one from the wagon. She stacked them where his hand could find the next piece without looking. She wore a glove on the hand with the bandage and left the other free to feel grain and splinters, so she would not mistake one for the other. She swept sawdust into soft piles and loved the smell. It reminded her of the first floor she had ever sat on and felt safe. By the porch stones, she pressed seeds into dry places and watered them from a bucket so the ground would get the habit. She did not ask the land to be kind. She asked it to make room. Nails went in true and bent when they had to. Jonah kept the bent ones in a small pile and straightened them later with 2 taps on the anvil spike he had set into a stump. He did not waste. The hammer beat out a slow music that made the grass shiver with sound. The roofline took shape. The shadow under it felt like a promise you could stand in and believe without saying it. At the creek he mended 3 posts where cattle had once leaned. He tied a fence splice with a short length of wire and took up slack with a stick twisted hard. The creek ran low and clear. Minnows worked the shallows like a thought that does not stop. He rolled up his sleeve and washed the rawhide marks on his forearm. The skin was brown there and new. He did not scrub. He let water cool it and carry what it could. He brought out the compass one afternoon when the wind had turned a little and the sky had a spring of high white in it. The brass had picked up scratches from riding in the vest. The hinge felt gritty. He wiped dust off with the tail of his shirt and set the compass on a porch rail. For a time, the needle quivered with no direction. Then it steadied and found the letter it wanted and held it. He watched it until his eyes believed what they saw. He shut the lid. The small click felt like a thing repaired, though he had not touched its heart. He did not open the watch. The weight of it sat against his ribs and kept its peace. Some machines sleep and do not wake for a long time. He let it. Mara laid stones at the edge of the porch until the line pleased her. She planted bluebonnets because a woman at the mercantile said they laugh at heat if you give them a start. She pushed seeds down with 2 fingers and sprinkled with a cut-off can she had poked holes in with a nail and a calm hand. When the first sprouts showed they were so small, she leaned low to see if she had imagined them. They held their place under sun and wind like brave things. She smiled without showing teeth. She did not clap. She kept watering. At night, they ate beans from a pot and meat when Jonah's lines came up lucky over a river pool. He split kindling with a slow knife and made the pieces talk in the fire. The smell of mesquite smoke sank into the denim of his shirt and did not leave. He set a tin cup near the coals so coffee would push heat into his hands. Mara hummed when the dark made room for it, not a song she knew, a sound that fit around them and made the air feel full. Sometimes he woke in the hard hour when all sound drops away. The barn frame stood as a shadow cut against more shadow. He lay and listened for steps that were not there. The dog he had not owned in years barked in memory. He would not call that dog. He got up and went to the porch. He stood and let the river talk itself into him until the beat inside his chest matched what ran in the channel. They rode the fence line one day when the light had the honey color that comes near evening. They came on a coyote hung in barbed wire, long dead, dried to rags. The wire had written a set of lines into the hide. Mara looked at the way the metal had cut and the way time finished the work. She said nothing. Jonah cut the wire where it bound hard so the fence would not sing that note anymore. He carried the limp hide to a gully and laid it there without comment. The smell of iron and dust hung in the air and then thinned. They kept to work. He set rafters and nailed purlins and lifted sheets of plank until the roof had a face. He hung a door that did not rub. He planed the bottom edge and tested it 3 times. He tied the hinges with leather washers so the squeak would not come in wet weather. He tied a lead rope to a ring in a corner so a frightened horse could be told the truth by steady hands and a knot that does not slip. The barn held the shape that lived in his head. The empty inside of it felt like a lung ready to take air. Mara made a shelf from a board that had a warping mind and forced it to keep straight with two braces set at the right angle. She set a tin cup and a tin plate on it and a folded cloth covered in a pattern she stitched with a bone needle. She had taken it from a dress that would never be a dress again and made something else from it. She rubbed oil into the shelf and watched it darken. The smell carried orange and something like bread when it first begins. Under the new roof, they stood one afternoon with wind low and heat playing quiet. Dust motes hung and looked like rivers of gold where light struck them. Mara said, "Does it ever let go?" She was not asking for hope. She was measuring the air with a short stick to see what it held. Jonah leaned his shoulder against a post that did not move when he did. He looked at the hairline cracks in the grain and at the nail heads set just shy of flush. He said, "It keeps its own pace." He picked up a coil of rope and tied a loop in it and pulled until the knot gave him the feeling in his palm that meant held. "We can ride beside it." His voice made the truth ordinary. He did not look to see what it did to her face. She nodded and touched the place on her forearm where letters lived. The skin had healed in small, raised lines. She traced them and then left them alone. A wind came up across the prairie and brought the smell of rain from a place that might be a lie. She lifted her nose to it and took one clean breath and let it go. They had visitors that did not ask for introductions. A boy with a mule came by and traded a sack of corn for 2 straight nails and a story about a flood years back. A woman with a basket of eggs crossed the yard and left the eggs with a note folded small that said, "For the girl." No name. The handwriting steady and careful. Jonah put the note under a coffee tin and kept it. He did not talk about it. He let the small kindness work without a face. In town, paper stayed busy. Doyle's hand kept neat stacks. Wires went out and came back with answers and coils of words. Jonah and Mara heard those things only when they made a supply run. They heard them inside a low hum of other talk and other needs. They bought nails and a new hatchet head and left. They did not linger for noises that were not work. They crossed the Salt Fork once on the way back and did not stop. The broken rail had been mended by someone with a steady hammer and a bag of bolts. The boards showed new bright-cut faces where saw teeth had kissed. The water ran low and green. Mara looked, but said nothing. Jonah looked once and then watched the horse's ears. On a morning so clean you could see the far line in a way that felt like a gift. He stood at the porch and watched the bluebonnets catch light. Their blue went dark, and then bright as clouds crossed, and the wind changed its mind. He felt the weight of the locket, and the compass, and the stopped watch. He left the locket where it was. He took the compass out, opened it, and let the needle steady one more time. He shut it and slid it back. Mara came to the porch and leaned against the post he had sanded smooth. She did not wear the shawl. The bandage was gone. A pale line ringed her wrist. Her hand had its strength again, and the small tremor had left. She held a tin cup of coffee and watched steam lift and go thin. She did not speak. He did not either. Wind moved in the grass with a sound like someone breathing close. The river answered every few seconds with the soft syllables that creaks no. A hawk drew a half circle and closed its wings and fell out of sight. The barn made its own quiet wood, talking to Nail's rope, taking up what little stretch it had. There was nothing to name in any of it. It sat in front of them and held still enough to be seen. They stood there and let it. Papers did their slow work. Wires ran out from Tascosa in straight lines and came back in bundles. Men with badges walked doors and laid warrants down where talk had lived. Wagons with tarps were opened and counted. Brands were read and matched to names that had been spoken in kitchens for years. A judge with a winter voice set dates. A ranger captain wrote in a hand that wasted nothing and arrived with men who knew the rhythm of a search. Jonah went in twice to sit at a table and put his name on pages that kept shape, even when men forgot the fine lines. He said what he had seen and left out what memory wanted to embroider. Mara stepped to a witness bench with her palms open against her skirt and told only the parts that belonged to paper. She said her name and the places she had been moved, and the tree and the knots and the heat. The room kept still because it had to. Sheriff Doyle stood behind his desk and kept his face where other faces could lean if they needed to. The gang that ran with Cade Ransom was pulled like fish from brush and sheds and beds made in hay. Some were taken in the act of selling someone else's calves. Others in the act of sitting at a card table, as if their fingers did not itch. They came to town in pairs and in fours, with their hats in their hands when told, and with their mouths full when not. The ledger gave them numbers with their names, whether they liked it or not. The map gave places and left no room for the old shuffle. Trials ran through late summer and into fall, when the sky turned a new color at evening and the air held a thin edge. Witnesses spoke and sat. Jurors watched until their eyes were sore. Sentences were ink and then iron. Some men took the long walk and the town held its breath and then breathed. More went to cells that would keep them until nothing inside could get out to hurt anything. Boxes in a back room were opened, and the things inside were walked across yards and through doors back to places where they had been missed. No one dragged the salt fork for a body. The creek did what creeks do and carried the weight away until its story changed to something without names in it. Men who liked to add to any tale said the water would give him up when it had had its fill. Men who knew water kept their mouths quiet. A hat with a sweat stain turned up on a market table one day and could have belonged to any hard season. It went to a head that needed shade and no one asked. Jonah's name stopped riding the back of other words. In the saloon where talk bounced, his name rested at the bar like any other and meant a man who bought his own beer and left when his glass was empty. Sheriff Doyle nailed 2 notices to the board with tacks set square. One was a list of convictions with sentences. The other was a word about a rancher whose record had been cut clean of old suspicion. The star painted on the front of the office still flaked. The drawer still stuck when pulled. The desk still collected rings from coffee cups. The town felt different only in the ways that matter. Mara chose the back room behind Doyle's office when letters had to be signed, and chose the boarding house when the room began to feel too much like a room. Miss Finch brought oatmeal in a tin that held heat and said nothing more than needed. A doctor with a good hand and a bad pen changed her bandage until her wrist closed and strength came back into the hand. When the pages were full and the trips to the courthouse grew fewer, Mara went back out to the river place and fit herself to the quiet there. The ranch took its shape and held it. The barn's post stayed plumb and the door kept true. The rope tied to a ring in the corner wore a smooth polish where a horse had worried it and then learned not to. The bluebonnets made a small border around the porch, and then when the first good rain came, decided to be many. They made their color and kept it like a promise that did not need to be spoken. On a late afternoon with heat laying itself down gently, Doyle rode up with dust in the blue of his coat and stopped near the gate Jonah had mended. He swung down with a grunt and tipped his hat back. He had 2 letters in his pocket and a receipt folded small for property that had been returned to the people it belonged to. He handed over what was Jonah's to see and to keep. He looked at the barn and the fence line and let a small thing in his face ease. It took time, Doyle said. He did not make more of it. He did not stand too long. He put his foot in the stirrup and went back to town because there were other doors that needed his hand on them. Evening light poured over the grass and made it look like a sheet moved by someone breathing. The river made its low talk behind cottonwoods that traded leaves for a soft coin sound when the wind asked. Jonah sat on the porch step and ran a whetstone along the edge of a blade with small wet strokes. Mara came out with 2 tin cups and set one by his knee. Coffee wore the smell of smoke and the sweetness of someone who had learned not to waste. She sat with her back to the post and tucked one leg under. He reached into his vest. The compass came to his hand. He opened it and watched the needle hover and then take a side and hold. He closed it and felt the roundness in his palm. The locket lay where it always lay. He touched it and left it. He pulled the watch and opened it because sometimes you do a thing even when you know how it will go. Light slid over the cracked face. He wound the stem until it set and would not turn. He held it to his ear out of habit and out of something that was not habit. The first tick was small and might have been the wind. The second did not belong to wind. The hand lifted one mark and settled. The sound sat between them and then made a third and a fourth. He kept the watch up a little longer than needed. He set it down in his palm and felt the small thing at work. He could count each beat. He looked at Mara. Her eyes were on the blue at the edge of the yard, where flowers took light, and then held it. He said, "You opened a knot." She did not look over. She said, "You tied the rest." She let the words be enough. She drank and blew across the surface of what was left in her cup. The steam lifted and went thin. The night came forward with cricket talk and the small pop of drying wood in the stove. Somewhere on the far bank, a bird gave one last note that did not belong to the day or to the full night. Jonah set the watch on the porch rail and let the ticking sit in the space between them. He found the end of a length of rope and tied a simple loop, not for any reason anyone would ask about, only because hands like to remember. He pulled and felt it set. He left it where it lay and leaned back until his shoulders met wood. He could smell mesquite and coffee and the clean damp that came off the river after the sun went. He could hear the barn make its small sounds as boards settled into night. The stars came on like old friends who know how to enter a room without making a shape of it. The bluebonnets kept their color even in the dark. The river turned and made a new sentence where it met a fallen branch and then kept on the way it had learned. The watch ticked. The rope held. The night did what nights do when a place has room for them. They stayed sitting where they were. They breathed the air that belonged to them. The house and the barn took the shape of home and did not call attention to it. The hours that followed belonged to no one but them and needed no witness. Thank you so much for listening to today's story. If this story resonated with you or made you reflect, I'd love to hear your thoughts, so feel free to share them in the comments below. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell so you won't miss the next story.